Lives? Amen. I invite you to take your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 2. We've been talking about getting fit in a lot of different ways, mentally, emotionally, physically, all kind of different ways. And this morning I'm going to address a healthy family or marriage. Now I know what some of you saying, you say, Brother Mark, I'm not married, so I don't know what you're talking to me. But let me just say this, if you're not, maybe you need to share this with someone who's thinking about getting married, or maybe somebody's having difficulty in their marriage and you need to share this with them. So this kind of applies in a lot of different ways. And let me say this, folks, we'll never have a strong country until we have strong families. And we'll never have strong families until we have strong marriages. You understand that? So as we look at this text today, kind of keep that in the back of your mind. I'll be real honest with you, I'm not going to throw up a bunch of statistics about divorce or any of those other things. I don't think we need to talk about that because, honestly, that has impacted most of our families in a lot of different ways. I'm not going to really tell you what's breaking families up and what's tearing them down. I'm going to approach it from a little bit different way, and I thought about my son Matthew when I did this because from what I understand in the medical community, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. Is that right? This means yes, that means no. Okay, yeah. I believe that's true. So obviously if there's some things that we can put in place to prevent things from happening, that's better than trying to cure it once it does. If I understand things right, if you eat right and you exercise and you take your medications the way that you should, your body functions properly. When you quit those things, it stops functioning the way that it should. Same thing happens within our relationships. When we do the proper things to maintain them, they will function the way that they properly should. You'll see in the context that I'm going to read to you in Genesis chapter 2, God has a function or a design for the family or the marriage. This being Valentine's Day, I couldn't leave this away. So read with me, chapter 2, verse 18. The Lord said, "It's not good that man should be alone. I will make a helpmate for him." And out of the ground the Lord formed every beast of the field and every fowl of the air and brought them unto Adam to see what he would call them. Whatsoever called them every living creature, that was named thereof. And Adam gave them, do you ever wonder how he named gnats? I'll just leave that alone. Then Adam gave names to all the cattle of the fowl of the air and to every beast of the field, but for Adam there was not a helpmate found for him. And the Lord caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam, and he slept. And he took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh inside thereof. And the rib, which the Lord had taken from man, he made a woman. And he brought her unto the man. And Adam said, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman, because she was taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed." There's several things I just want to bring to your attention here for a moment about this relationship. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've been married over 30 years. I've learned a few things along the way. There are some rules. Now, let me say this. These are not biblical rules. These are rules I have learned. Jacob, help me out there with some of the rules. Number one, the female always makes the rules. I wrote these small, so you just have to take my word for it. The rules are subject to change without notice. Remember, she wrote the rules. Number three, no male can possibly know all the rules. If the female suspects the male knows all the rules, she must immediately change all the rules. Number five, write this one down, guys. The female is never wrong. Ladies, this is your shot. You better hang in here. If it appears the female is wrong, it is because of a flagrant misunderstanding caused by something the male did or said. The female can change her mind at any time. The male must never change his mind without express written consent of the female. The female has every right to be angry or upset at any time. The male must remain calm at all times. unless the female wants him to be angry or upset. The female must, under no circumstances, let the male know whether she wants him to be angry or upset, though. The male is expected to read the mind of the female at all times. At all times, what is important to the female is at all times, what is important is what the female meant and not what she said. If the male does not abide by the rules, it is because he can't take the heat, lacks backbone, or is a wimp. Number 16, if the male at any time believes he is right, he must refer back to number 5. Remember what number 5 was? The female is never wrong. Number 17, every house belongs to the oldest female living there. Remember those rules, guys. God gave us a design here in Genesis chapter 2. I have copies of those, guys, in case you want it after church, just to let you know. God made a design for marriage. Genesis chapter 2. Listen, folks, this design that God made was not by government or even by the church. It was designed by God. Marriage will not function ideally and properly unless God is at the center of that marriage. Now, I'm not telling you there will not be any problems. There will be problems. Why? Because we still live in the flesh. I've given you this illustration on several occasions, but it's a triangle. Do you understand what I'm talking about? You can hold your hands like a triangle. If you put the man in the lower right-hand corner and the lady in the lower left-hand corner, if you notice as they grow closer to God, what do? They grow closer to who? Each other. If God is at the top, He's at the pinnacle. As those relationships begin to grow, as they grow closer to God, obviously they will grow closer to one another. And ultimately that's what you want in the relationship. God was very wise in defining and designing what marriage was. Let me say this. Problems usually occur when we become selfish and we put ourselves at the top of the triangle instead of putting God there. That's usually what happens in a marriage. Most of the time when I counsel those that have any type of marital problems, not thinking about anybody particularly, but most what happens is that person begins to put their self at the top. Not their spouse, not God, but themselves. And they work toward the goal of pleasing themselves instead of working in that relationship to please God and then drawing closer to one another as well. But notice something from our text. God made man and woman. Now, woman was made from the side of man, understand this, and not from the ground. Remember, men, ladies, stay with me for a minute. Men were made from dirt. Ladies, you were made from the side of the man. Why did God do that? I don't know. Maybe He's trying to suggest the elevated status of Eve, or at least I think God is trying to tell us she is on equal status in the eyes of God. Go back and look in Acts chapter 10, again in Ephesians chapter 6. It says there that God is not a respecter of persons. What does that mean? That means God sees everyone equally in His mind and in His eyes. Everyone is on the same plane. Not one is better than the other. God sees all people exactly the same. Need I remind you, Christ died for all. For God so loved the world, not just man, not just woman, but God so loved the world that He gave His only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in Him should not perish but have everlasting life. God is not a respecter of persons. So God sees man and woman equally in His eyes. And folks, let me just say something. If God sees you equally, you should see each other equally as well. That's the way God designed it. Now, are there different roles of responsibility? Yes. Are there different roles of accountability? Yes. That's in Ephesians chapter 5. We'll look at that later. But God had a design. In fact, if you read in our text, it says that God made. That's what it says, right? God made. That's an interesting word in the Hebrew. It actually means construction. And you guys that are in the construction field, you know what I'm talking about here. When you construct something or you work on a building or a home, it means that there was a design, a specific design. Most of the times you don't walk out into a construction site and there not be a plan laid out that someone is hopefully following. It shows where the electrical and the plumbing and everything has to be. It is a specific design that is laid out by the architect, the designer. That's exactly what the word made here means. It means that God constructed with thought and with plan the man and the woman and the design of marriage. It was not an afterthought by God. It was something that God specifically designed in His wisdom and His understanding. God designed this perfect man, this perfect woman, and a perfect union together. That's what it says. Now, something that has been designed, every time I've been involved with it, it's designed with several things in mind, both beauty and function. So God created this woman and this man for both of them to be beautiful in the eyes of God, in the eyes of each other, and also to carry a specific function. That's what a part of the design is. So God made woman with this design in place. She was not an afterthought. She was not something that God just said, oh, I messed up, I need to do something better here, or do something more here. He had a specific plan in mind. He had a specific function in mind, and He made it in His image as well. Folks, let me say something this morning. God has a plan for every person. We're talking about marriage this morning. I know in some few cases it is God's plan for some to remain single. But that's not true of very many. I believe it's up to us as men and women to seek God's plan and then to follow that plan when God reveals it. Now I'm going to get a little practical here because of 20 years of youth ministry and now senior pastor ministry. Stay with me for a minute. Don't pray for God, please send me a godly woman or man that I can marry and raise my family with and serve you with. Don't pray that prayer and then when God brings that person to you, say, I think I'll do this on my own now, God. I got it from here. No, don't stop praying then. That's when you need to pray more. God reveals His plan. And we pray, and I know you as parents, you pray for your children to find godly mates, godly people that they can share their life with, that they can raise their family with, that they can serve the church and serve God with. You pray for that, and I'm hoping that every young adult here and every teenager here is praying that God will put someone in their life that they can live their life with and honor God with their life. I hope that's what you're praying for. But when God fulfills that prayer, don't stop praying and seeking God then. Continue to seek Him. Continue to follow after Him. Don't take matters into your own hands at that point. And listen, once again, some of you guys have been married a lot longer than I have, but after 30 years, I understand after you get married, you need to pray even more. Because let me say this, folks, Satan wants to destroy that marriage. He wants to tear that marriage down. He wants that family to be ruined. That's exactly what he wants. And so you as a husband and wife, you need to pray even more. After you're married, God, help us, protect us, and keep us in your care. But I want you to understand something this morning. What God has done, God has made this, God has completed it, He designed it in His wisdom. God made marriage. But it didn't stop there, because I want you to notice something in verse 23. It says there was a covenant made by man. Notice what he says there. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. That doesn't make a lot of sense to us now. But if you understand in the Old Testament, flesh is the Old Testament symbol for weakness. The bone was a symbol of strength. What Adam is saying here is a covenant relationship. Bone means to be strong. So Adam understood something immediately when he saw Eve. Number one, God gave Eve to him to be his weakness. Now stay with me for a minute. What does that mean by that? She was going to be the desire of his heart. When he saw her, when he was with her, she was his weakness. Others could come, others could go, others could come into the picture or into life, but she was the one. She was his weakness. When he saw her, nothing else mattered. Guys, do you remember that day? Do you still have that weakness, that spot, that when you see that person that God has put into your life, that she is that one that you almost just become weak when you're around her? But he didn't stop there, because Eve also became his strength. You see, Eve made Adam strong. She would be his strength. Think about it, folks. When they were dismissed from the garden, who would they lean upon? Each other. When they faced the murder of their son by the other son, who was there for Adam? It was Eve. She was his strength. She was the one that was there in humanity, helping him and giving the strength that he needed. She would not only be his weakness, but she would be his strength. But that flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone now speaks of a common relationship of loyalty as well. If you go back and read later on in Scripture in 2 Samuel chapter 5, there was a group of men who come to visit Daniel when he was battling for his life. And they told Daniel, "You are now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh, David." What was they trying to tell David there? There is a covenant relationship here, David. We will fight to the death for you, David. We will support you. We love you. We will do anything we can for you, David. We stand by you. We are now flesh of your flesh. That's exactly what is referred to here in Genesis chapter 2. This covenant relationship that Adam was making with Eve, and Eve with Adam said, "Listen, you are mine, and I am with you to the death. You are now, I am committed to you, and nothing can separate this relationship." It was a covenant relationship. We don't understand covenants now in this world we live in. But in the Old Testament, the covenant was a very powerful thing. Remember, God made a covenant with Noah that he would not flood the world anymore. He made a covenant with Abraham that his people will be as the sands of the sea. He made a covenant with Israel as well that he would be their God, their protector, and their provider. In fact, that covenant was fulfilled through his Son, Jesus Christ. You see, let me remind you something about that covenant relationship. In every one of those covenants that I talked to you about, the covenant was never altered because of the circumstances. The commitment was never ceased. It was never faltered because of the circumstances. Did Israel sin against God? Yes. Did Noah at times struggle in his relationship with God? Perhaps. Did Abraham? Yes. But in every one of those covenant relationships, did God ever wane in the commitment? No. Folks, listen to me. For our marriages to be as God has designed them, the commitment never wanes. It never falters. It never fails because of the circumstances. Think about it, folks. Adam and Eve. Their sin in the garden made them be removed from the garden, from the presence of God. Their whole life changed. Was their commitment to each other changed? No. Look at the phrase there in the text that I read to you in verse 23. Woman, she shall be called woman because she was taken from man. There's a little bit better reading of that because it says she shall be female because she was taken from male. There's a very clear pattern that God's trying to show us here. That wording shows us that both the identity in marriage and the equality of the genders is seen in the eyes of God. So God saw man and woman exactly the same. He created them perfectly together. Now let me get to where I wanted to be in verse 24. So stay with me for a minute. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Some people have asked this question, why does the man have to leave his mother and father? Why does that happen? There's an old saying, and I didn't know this until I started kind of reading along about this text. It says, a son is a son until he gets a wife. A daughter is a daughter for life. I don't know if that's true or not. Verse 24 is a very powerful verse. It does. Let me say this. God's trying to get you to understand the exclusiveness of the union. That's what he's trying to get you to understand in verse 24. You see, the focus here oftentimes is when we look at verse 24 that we're talking about just another person who's coming into the relationship, somehow or another, and threatening that relationship. But let me say this. The focus should not just be on the family relationship, even though cutting the strings is what should happen. I agree with that. Yeah, I got a wonderful book in my office sometime I want you to read, and some of you have already read it, called The 10 Commandments of Marriage. And one of those commandments in the 10 Commandments of Marriage is cutting the apron strings. I'll get it right here in a minute. Cutting the apron strings. And sometimes when we look at that, we say, well, then the man, he needs to leave and not be so tied to his mother, and all those things should happen. But let me just kind of suggest something to you this morning. The focus shouldn't just be on mom or dad, but it should be on any relationship that causes potential harm to the marriage. I don't care if it's a friend, I don't care if it's a coworker, I don't care what it is. If there's any relationship that is causing harm to your marriage, God says it doesn't need to be there. The word forsake means to leave, or cleave means to cling, implying a severing of one relationship and the beginning of another relationship. I tell this to young people who come into my office all the time and say, Brother Mark, can we get married? Here's one of the things that I tell them. Some of you guys will remember this. It's your marriage now. You need to learn from your mom and dad or the relatives that are around you have had long established relationships. You need to learn from those relationships. But at this point in time, listen to me, it's your marriage. You are responsible for its health, and you are responsible for its happiness. Learn from others, but live your own marriage. I know that's hard. But listen, when you make that union between one another, and you commit yourself to one another and before God, listen to me, come time when you are going to be held accountable and responsible for what you have done with what God has blessed you with, listen to me, you're not going to stand before your mom and dad, you're not stand before your aunt and uncle or your grandparents, you're going to stand before God and be held accountable. So as you live your life, as you build your marriage, as you protect that marriage, I want you to understand, it's your marriage. Do you learn from others? Yes. Do you see the mistakes and the good things that they have done? Yes. But listen to me, and I'm going to be cruel right here, but stay with me for a minute. Men, look at me just for a minute, all the men. You understand that you're ultimately responsible. You are the spiritual leader of that home. And you are responsible for the health and happiness of that marriage. That's what God says. In fact, let me show you how I know that. Look in verse 24. Stay with me for a minute. You don't see any mention of a family yet, do you? Children. It's not what it says. What God's trying to tell us here is the man does not leave his family to start another family. But the focus in verse 24 is on the union of the man and the woman. You understand, unless the union is what it needs to be, the family can never function as it's supposed to be. So the first priority must be on what? The union of the man and the woman. The bringing together of the man and the woman. The health and happiness of that marriage between the man and the woman. That must be the first focus even before the family. Listen to me. I dealt with young people through my entire youth ministry who often told me, I wish my mom and dad, I wish my mom and dad, you know how many times I heard, I wish my mom and dad were together. Live better lives. Were better examples. I wish I could learn from my mom and dad. You see, those children, they can never be what they should be until they see that union lived out, growing closer together to God, growing closer together to one another. They can never understand what God wants until they see it lived out. You see, unless the union is what it needs to be, the family will never function properly. If you look at the text in verse 24, let me give you one more hint. Stay with me for a minute. Man by himself is not one flesh. He's not complete. Look at the text. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. The man by himself is not complete. A woman by herself is not complete. I think I shared this the other night with my Wednesday night class. Just remember, stay with me. God made the man and wife to be complements to one another. Now, I'm not a mathematician, but stay with me once again. When I was about in the 8th grade, they taught me about complementary angles. You ever heard that? Some of y'all shake your head, yes, just so I know you're with me for a minute. I'll give you an example here. There's a 90-degree angle. You know what that is? Just a square. Just a right, okay? Then you got another one going the other way. When you put those two angles together, they could make a complete half circle. You know what I'm talking about? 180 degrees across. 90 degrees and 90 degrees. Those are what they call complementary angles. They complete one another. God made man and a woman to complement one another, to make each other complete. How do I know that? I'm glad you asked. Stay with me just for a minute. Think about it physically. The design of the human. We know this obviously from procreation. God designed them to function physically as a complement to one another. That flies in the face of everything you can think about the homosexual lifestyle. I'm sorry. God made them to complement one another. Physically. God made them to complement one another emotionally. Guys, here comes your shot. You don't need to be told you're beautiful, do you? Do you? You really don't need to hear I love you too much. But listen to me. A woman does. Women don't need to feel like they're in control because they know they are. But men do. They need that emotional feeling that I can fix this. I'm in control here. They need that. Women don't need that feeling. So emotionally we're made there to complement one another. Even emotionally we are. Physically we are. But even psychologically, think about it for a minute. Men are these tough, rugged kind of guys, and women are nurturing and compassionate. God made us to complement one another in every way. And so we're not whole, we're not complete until we bring that union together as God designed it in one flesh. Going closer to Him. A complement. So if God designed it, you say, Brother Mark, there's two complements, yeah, and you put them together and they're together, but what makes them stick together? I'm glad you asked. Who made this? Who made this design? Who formed this union? God. So these two angles, these two complements are brought together, but what holds them together? What's the glue? God. You see, without God, what do? They fall back apart. You've seen that. You put two blocks together and you try to hold them there, but when you pick them up or someone bumps them, they move, they fall apart. But when you glue them together, they're there. And in this relationship, this complementary relationship, man and woman come together, but the things that hold them together is not their money, or their kids, or their love, but it's God. He's that glue that holds it together. So let me ask you a question this morning. Who or what is at the center of your marriage? At the center of your family? You see, I'm convinced that, again, we want God to heal our land. We want God to revive us again. But folks, that's not going to happen until we begin in our homes to change what we think and who controls our homes and our marriages. So let me ask you that question. Who is at the center of your marriage? Number two, is your marriage functioning the way that God designed it to function? Is there a union that's there? Is God at the center of it? Is He the glue that makes it work? Are you growing closer together with Him so you grow closer together with one another? Maybe the last question is the one that's the hardest. Will you allow God to make your marriage to become all it can be? Brother Mark, I know what you're thinking. You say, Brother Mark, I know people that's lived and been married for 60 years. They've never darkened the door of the church. They don't care anything about God, and they seem like they're getting along great. They've been married 60 years together. Let me say something. They're missing out on what it could be. Because, see, God designed it for a specific way, and God wants it to function in a specific way. So the question is, will you allow God to change your life, to change your thoughts, to change your desires, so that your marriage can be all that it can be? That it can be. Why miss out on one of the greatest things God ever designed for man, marriage? Why would you want to miss out on exactly what it can be for what it is? Let's pray together. Our Father, some things are just hard. And it's hard at times for us to admit that things just aren't right. Lord, probably all of us in this room